Working as a radio host during the early hours of the morning always gave me a sense of peace. The studio was my sanctuary, a place where I could be alone with my thoughts and the music. The station was small but well equipped, and the night shift was quiet, with only a few listeners calling in. I cherished the serenity of the nights, where everything seemed to slow down, and I had complete control over what went on air. My job was to play soft music, read a few listener messages, and occasionally take live calls. That particular night, everything seemed normal. The soft lights in the studio created a cozy atmosphere, and I felt comfortable as I adjusted the sound and selected the next songs. It was a routine I knew well, and that gave me a certain level of comfort. The feeling of being isolated from the outside world, with just my voice and the radio waves connecting me to the listeners, was one of the reasons I loved that job. The hours passed slowly, but I didn't mind. The studio was my refuge. Around 2 a.m, while I was preparing the next set of songs, I started reflecting on how my life had changed since I began working this shift. There was something magical about being awake when the rest of the world was asleep. The early hours were mine, and I loved that sense of freedom. The streets were always empty, and the silence of the night was only broken by the soft music I broadcasted on the radio. I was so absorbed in my thoughts that I almost didn't notice the studio phone ringing. When the phone rang, I quickly answered, expecting it to be just a listener wanting to make a music request or comment on the show. It was common to receive sporadic calls during the early morning hours, usually from lonely people who found comfort in the music and the company of my voice. I answered the call with a smile in my voice, prepared for another casual conversation that would help pass the time until the end of my shift. Little did I know that this would be the first of many disturbing calls that would completely change my night. The voice on the other end was calm, but there was something about it that immediately made me uncomfortable. "I'm outside the station, watching you," the man said casually, as if he were talking about the weather. For a moment, I was silent, unsure of how to react. The idea that someone was outside watching me made my heart race. I tried to quickly compose myself, convinced that it was just a prank. With a nervous laugh, I ended the call and went back to work, trying to ignore the discomfort that the call had caused. Still feeling uneasy from the call, I tried to focus on the show and the music playing. I pushed away the thoughts about what the man had said, telling myself it was just a joke from some bored listener. However, the idea that someone could be out there watching me wouldn't leave my mind. I looked at the studio windows, but all I saw was the darkness of the night. There was nothing unusual, and I tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. I continued with my work, announcing the next song and reading some messages from listeners who had sent texts during the night. My voice was steady, but my heart was still racing. The station was located in a relatively isolated area, and during the early hours, the building was almost deserted. There was a security guard on the night shift, but he rarely passed by the studio area. This realization began to bother me. What was once a feeling of peace and isolation now started to feel like a vulnerability. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. My whole body tensed up. I answered hesitantly, hoping to hear a friendly voice on the other end, but it was the same man. "I know what you're wearing," he said, accurately describing the outfit I had on that night. A chill ran down my spine. He really could see me. The idea that someone was watching me so close and yet out of my reach was terrifying. "You think you can ignore me, but I see everything," he continued, his voice maintaining a calm, almost casual tone. I quickly hung up the phone, my heart racing. This time I couldn't shake off the fear that was growing inside me. I looked around the studio, trying to find some logical explanation for what was happening. Was he outside, spying on me through the windows? Or were there hidden cameras I didn't know about? The feeling of being watched started to consume me, and for the first time, the studio, which had once been my refuge, now felt like a trap. For a few minutes, I was paralyzed, not knowing what to do. I didn't want to seem paranoid, but the reality was that someone was really watching me, and he was playing with my nerves. I decided that I needed to calm down and think of a rational solution. I continued with the show, trying not to show the fear I was feeling. But I knew that the night had only just begun, and that call was a sign of something much more disturbing to come. The calls didn't stop there. In the following hours, the phone rang several times, and every time I answered, it was the same voice. With each call, the man became bolder, more disturbing. He began to describe not just my clothes, but also the movements I made in the studio. "I saw you look out the window," he said in one of the calls, and I felt my stomach turn. He was really watching me, and the feeling of being so vulnerable began to overwhelm me. With each new call, my fear grew. What had once seemed like a prank was now turning into something much more threatening. The man's voice was calm, almost cold, and that only made everything more frightening. He talked about how I moved the controls in the studio, how I adjusted the microphone, and even how I tucked my hair behind my ear. There was no denying that he could see me. The idea that I was being watched so closely was terrifying. I tried to act naturally, to continue the show as if nothing was happening, but the truth was that I was panicking. Every time the phone rang, my heart would race. I knew I should hang up the phone, ignore the calls, but part of me felt like I needed to know what he would say next. Every word from him felt like a direct blow to my sense of security, and I began to question whether I was really safe in that studio. The feeling of being hunted was overwhelming. I looked at the clock and realized there were still a few hours left in my shift. Time seemed to drag, each minute longer than the last. Every time I heard the phone ring, a wave of panic washed over me. The darkness outside seemed more oppressive, as if it were closing in around me. I knew I needed to do something, but the fear was paralyzing me. I felt as if I were trapped in a nightmare, with no way out. Finally, after another disturbing call, I decided that I couldn't go on like this. I needed help. I picked up the phone and with trembling hands called the building security. I explained the situation, trying to keep my voice calm, but it was impossible to hide the terror I felt. They promised to send someone to patrol the area around the building. Meanwhile, I continued to hear the man's voice in my head, and the feeling of being watched intensified even more. The studio, which had once been my refuge, now felt like an oppressive place, full of shadows and potential threats. I began to notice details I had previously ignored: the faint hum of the equipment, the distant sound of the air conditioner, and, most disturbingly, the lights in the building's hallway, which normally stayed off during the night, had suddenly turned on. This never happened unless someone was walking through there. The fear I felt intensified. The idea that the stalker might be inside the building, so close to me, was unbearable. I looked at the studio door, expecting that at any moment it would be opened by someone with bad intentions. Every little noise made me jump, and the feeling of vulnerability was overwhelming. I began to think that maybe he had managed to enter the building, and that the security of the place was not enough to protect me. I knew I needed to stay calm, but it was difficult. I continued with the show, my voice sounding more tense with each announcement, while my eyes remained fixed on the studio door, expecting the worst. The feeling of being watched continued to grow, and paranoia began to take hold of me. Every time I looked at the windows, I expected to see a shadowy figure outside watching me. The darkness out there seemed to have a life of its own, as if it were conspiring against me. I tried to distract myself with the music, but every time the phone rang, my heart raced again. The man's words echoed in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was about to act. The idea that someone could be watching me so closely, describing my every move, was terrifying. I began to question whether I should leave the studio and try to hide somewhere else, but the idea of leaving the relative safety of the studio scared me even more. Finally, I decided I needed to protect myself somehow. I locked the studio door, trying to create a barrier between me and the danger outside. But even so, the fear didn't disappear. The man's words still echoed in my mind, and the idea that he could be waiting to attack at any moment left me panicked. I knew security was on the way, but each second felt like an eternity, and I wasn't sure if they would arrive in time. With fear growing by the moment, I finally decided I couldn't wait passively any longer. I picked up the phone again and called the building security, explaining the situation with a trembling voice. "There's someone watching me, and he's threatening to come in," I said, trying to stay calm, but it was impossible to hide the terror I felt. Security promised to arrive as quickly as possible, but I knew it could take a few minutes. And in my state, every second counted. While I waited, the studio phone rang again. The sound made me jump and my instinct told me not to answer, but something in me knew I needed to hear what he had to say. I answered, my heart in my throat. "They won't get here in time, Nicole," the man's voice whispered on the other end. "I'm very close now." Those words hit me like a blow. Panic took over me, and I felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. He knew I had called security. He was closer than I had imagined. I hung up the phone, trying to stay calm. I was trembling, but I knew I needed to act. I locked the studio door, reinforcing the barrier between me and the stalker, but I knew that might not be enough. I looked around, searching for something I could use to defend myself. I grabbed a heavy microphone, holding it tightly, and prepared for the worst. The studio was small, and I knew that if he managed to get in, I would have little room to escape. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. The silence was crushing, each second stretching out like an eternity. The only sound was my own breathing, fast and shallow. I started to imagine all possible scenarios. Him forcing his way in, finding me cornered with no way out. The fear was paralyzing me, but I knew I had to be ready for anything. I kept gripping the microphone tightly, as if it were my only defense against the terror that was approaching. Finally, I heard a sound from outside, the noise of doors slamming shut. My heart raced. I knew security was on the way, but what if it wasn't them? What if it was him, finally deciding to confront me? The fear consumed me, and I could barely breathe. Every second, the footsteps grew closer, and the tension inside me reached an unbearable level. I knew I was about to face something that could change my life forever, and the thought that I might not get out of there alive terrified me. Locked in the studio, panic began to take over me in a way I had never experienced before. With the heavy microphone in hand, I looked around, searching for anything I could use to protect myself. I grabbed a chair and positioned it to partially block the door, creating an improvised barrier. Every sound that came from outside made my heart race. The footsteps were getting closer, and the sound of something scratching at the door made me hold my breath. I knew he was there, trying to get in, and the terror of being confronted by someone I couldn't see, but who seemed to know everything about me, was paralyzing. Every second felt like an eternity, and the thought that he might manage to break down the door pushed me to the brink of despair. The silence outside was as oppressive as the sounds that had preceded it. I stayed still, trying to control my breathing and listen for any hint of movement. The fear was consuming me, and I knew I needed to prepare for the worst. The thought that he could enter at any moment, catching me off guard, was unbearable. I began to imagine all possible scenarios, and none of them seemed to end well for me. Finally, I heard a distinct sound, the door handle being forced. My heart stopped for a moment, and I knew he was trying to get in. I gripped the microphone even tighter, feeling adrenaline rush through my veins. I was ready to fight, but the fear of facing someone so determined to reach me was overwhelming. I knew I didn't have many chances of coming out victorious, but I couldn't just give up. As the noise at the door continued, I prepared for the imminent confrontation. Every muscle in my body was tense, ready to react to any sign that he was coming in. The sound of the door creaking as it was forced made me realize that time was running out. I needed to resist, even if it meant facing my worst nightmare. The weight was unbearable, and I knew I was about to face something that would change my life forever. The studio door continued to creak as it was forced, and the sound of heavy kicks on the other side left me petrified. Every passing second seemed to bring the danger closer, and the tension inside me reached an unbearable level. The idea that someone was determined to get in, that I was being hunted like prey, left me in a state of absolute panic. All I wanted was to get out of that situation, but I knew I had nowhere to run. The kicks on the door intensified, and I knew he was about to enter. Adrenaline coursed through my body, and every nerve was on high alert. I knew that if he managed to get through the door, I would have to fight for my life. I gripped the microphone tighter, trying to prepare for the impact, but the fear was paralyzing me. The idea of confronting someone who was so obsessed with me was terrifying, and I could barely think clearly. Suddenly, I heard a sound that made my heart almost stop. the sound of the door beginning to give way. He was managing to force his way in, and I knew I didn't have much time. All possible scenarios flashed through my mind, and none of them seemed to end well for me. I was on the brink of despair, trying to find a way out, but I knew I was cornered. The fear of being attacked, of being alone against someone so determined, was overwhelming. As the sound of the door giving way grew louder, I began to hear another sound, the shouts of other people. My heart raced with a mix of relief and panic. Security was finally arriving, but I didn't know if they would get there in time. The sound of the guards' shouts seemed so distant, and the thought that the stalker might get in before help arrived was unbearable. I was trapped in a state of pure terror, hoping that the worst wouldn't happen. Finally, I heard the footsteps outside become more hurried, and then the sound of commanding voices became clearer. Security was there, and their presence brought immediate relief. But the fear was still there, and I knew that even with security present, the impact of what had happened would continue to haunt me. When the guards finally arrived, I felt a wave of relief but also a mix of conflicting emotions. The stalker was captured just as he was about to break into the studio, and I watched as he was taken away, still shouting incoherent words about how he was saving my life. The sight of him, with his face twisted with rage and despair, is something that will be etched in my memory forever. As much as I knew the immediate danger had passed, the trauma of everything that happened was still fresh. I never returned to work the night shift again, and despite the passing of time, the memories of that night still haunt me. The feeling of being watched, of having my privacy violated in such a profound way, is something I carry with me every day. I know the immediate danger has passed, but the sense of vulnerability, that the worst could happen at any moment, is something I've never been able to leave behind. My name is Sophia, and I work as a nurse at a rehabilitation clinic. The night shift, though lonely, has always been my favorite. I like the tranquility that the early hours bring, with absolute silence taking over the corridors. My responsibilities include monitoring the patients and ensuring that everyone is safe and comfortable. The job is usually calm, but there's always a certain tension in the air, especially because of one particular patient, known for his aggressive behavior. That night, I was determined to keep everything under control, but little did I know that something was about to go terribly wrong. As I reviewed the patient list, I noticed that everything was in order. Most of them were already asleep, and I was preparing for a quiet night. However, there was a restlessness I couldn't ignore, an unsettling feeling that something wasn't right. As I walked through the corridors, the sound of my footsteps was the only noise breaking the silence, echoing through the cold walls of the clinic. It was a feeling of peace, but also of isolation. The hours passed slowly, and I was almost convinced it would be an uneventful night. But then, something unexpected happened. While doing my nightly rounds, I noticed that the door to the problematic patient's room was ajar. My heart raced when I realized he was not in his room. How had he managed to leave without anyone noticing? The clinic was completely silent, and the idea of a patient with a history of aggression being loose was frightening. My mind began to work frantically, trying to devise a plan to deal with the situation as the reality of it began to set in. I walked slowly down the corridor, keeping my eyes and ears alert for any sign of movement. I knew I had to act quickly, but I also needed to be cautious. This patient was known for his unpredictable behavior, and I had no idea what he might be planning. The clinic, which had once seemed so safe, now felt full of hidden dangers, and the sense that something was about to happen kept me on high alert. I decided I needed to find the patient before he caused any trouble. The safety of the other patients and the staff depended on it. With each step I took, my heart beat faster, and the silence that had once been comforting now felt threatening. I knew the night would be long, and I was determined to do whatever was necessary to ensure everyone's safety. But the feeling of unease continued to grow within me. My first instinct was to check the corridors near the patient's room. I walked quickly but cautiously, trying to listen for any sound that might indicate where he could be. The silence was overwhelming, and the clinic seemed to transform into an endless labyrinth where every dark corner hid a potential threat. I knew I had to remain calm and rational, but the reality that the aggressive patient was loose kept me on edge. I checked every corner of the corridors, looking inside empty treatment rooms and common areas of the clinic. At every open door, my heart skipped a beat, expecting to find the patient hiding, ready to attack. But everywhere I looked, I found only emptiness. The absence of any sign of him only increased my anxiety. Where could he be? And what was he planning? These questions echoed in my mind, and the sense of urgency grew with every passing second. As I continued my search, the lights in the clinic began to flicker, casting strange shadows on the walls. With each flicker, the environment seemed to change, becoming darker and more menacing. I tried to ignore the feeling of discomfort, but the fear that something terrible was about to happen was undeniable. I knew I couldn't let fear paralyze me. I needed to find the patient and ensure he didn't hurt anyone, but the tension in the air was palpable, as if the clinic itself was aware of the impending danger. Finally, I decided to check the security cameras in the control room. Maybe I could locate the patient through the recordings, and that would give me an idea of where he was. The control room was downstairs, and as I descended the stairs, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every step I took echoed ominously, as if the sound was being amplified by something more than the clinic's walls. The thought that he might be watching me, waiting for the right moment to attack, made my heart race. When I reached the control room, I quickly began reviewing the camera recordings. The monitors displayed black and white images of the clinic's corridors, and the sense of unease grew with each image. Then, in one of the cameras, I saw a shadow quickly pass by a corridor near the west wing of the clinic. My heart leapt. It was him. I knew I had to go there, but the thought of confronting him alone was terrifying. Even so, I had no choice. I had to act. Determined to confront the patient, I quickly headed towards the west wing of the clinic, where I had seen him on the camera. The corridor was shrouded in silence, and the only thing I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. The fear settled deeper with every step I took. When I reached the corridor, it was empty. Nothing seemed out of place, and there was no sign of the patient. The anxiety of knowing he was close, yet still out of reach, made my heart race uncontrollably. While investigating the corridor, the clinic's internal phone rang, making me jump in fright. Hesitantly, I answered the phone, trying to stay calm. On the other end of the line, a familiar but disturbing voice whispered, "I'm waiting for you." It was the patient. My entire body tensed up at hearing those words, and the sense of panic intensified. He was playing with me, trying to scare me. I knew I couldn't let him see how much he was affecting me, but the truth was that fear was consuming me. With a trembling voice, I asked where he was, but all I got in response was a low, sinister laugh before the line went dead. The silence that followed was deafening. I gripped the phone tightly, as if it could offer me some protection against the invisible threat surrounding me. I knew I had to act quickly, but the thought of being hunted by someone who knew the clinic as well as I did was terrifying. I decided to continue my search, moving quickly through the corridors, hoping to find him before he could cause any harm. But with each door I opened, each room I checked, I found nothing but darkness and silence. The clinic, which had always been a place of healing and recovery, now felt like a trap, full of dark corners and hidden dangers. The feeling of being watched was constant, and every unexpected sound made my heart jump. As I walked, the lights began to fail again, flickering and casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. I knew the patient was somewhere nearby, perhaps watching my every move. The clinic, which once was a safe place, now felt like a labyrinth of terror. The tension was palpable, and I felt I was being led to an inevitable confrontation. I needed to find a way to face him, but fear and uncertainty were paralyzing me. I had to keep a cool head and find a way to neutralize him before he caught me off guard. As I advanced down the corridor, a sharp noise suddenly echoed, as if something metal had been dragged across the floor. My nerves were on edge, and every noise seemed amplified. I gripped the heavy object I had picked up as an improvised weapon, feeling the sweat on my hands. I reached a fork in the corridor and paused for a moment, trying to decide where to go. The clinic was engulfed in shadows, and the only light came from the flickering bulbs that barely did their job. Then I heard the sound of something repeatedly hitting a door. It seemed to come from one of the more remote treatment rooms. I knew I couldn't avoid the confrontation much longer. Taking a deep breath, I headed towards the sound, my steps echoing down the empty corridor. Every step I took towards the room made my heart beat faster. When I finally reached the door, I paused for a moment to listen. The sound had stopped, and everything was silent again. Carefully, I turned the handle and slowly opened the door. The room was empty, but there were signs that someone had been there recently. One of the beds was unmade, and a chair was knocked over on the floor. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I knew he was nearby, perhaps hiding in the shadows. Suddenly, the lights failed completely, plunging the room into total darkness. I stood still, trying to hear any sound that might indicate the patient's location. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like he could hear it. Then, a soft whisper came from somewhere nearby. "I'm right here, Sophia." The fear I felt at that moment was indescribable. I turned towards the sound, raising my improvised weapon, ready to defend myself. But there was nothing there. The darkness seemed to swallow me, and I could barely see a foot in front of me. The only thing guiding me was the sound of his voice, which now seemed to come from all directions. He was playing with me, taking advantage of the environment to destabilize me. I needed to get out of that room and find a more defensible position where I could see what was around me. I began to move slowly towards the door, trying not to make any noise. As I advanced through the darkness, I felt something cold touch my shoulder. I spun around quickly, but there was nothing there. My heart was beating so fast that I felt I might faint at any moment. The idea of being alone with that patient, in a clinic that now felt like a deadly trap, made me want to run for the exit and not look back. But I knew I couldn't run. I had to face the situation head-on. Finally, I managed to get out of the room and back into the corridor. The lights were flickering again, casting unsettling shadows on the walls. I knew he was close, watching me, waiting for the right moment to act. The tension was almost unbearable, but I couldn't let fear control me. I needed to think about how to protect myself, how to get out of there alive. With the heavy object still in my hands, I started to move towards the security room, where I could lock myself in until help arrived. As I walked, I heard footsteps behind me again, followed by a low laugh that echoed through the corridors. He was close, very close. It seemed like he was enjoying my fear, as if it were a game to him. I tried to stay calm, but the feeling that he was just a few steps away made my skin crawl. I knew I couldn't take long. I needed to find a safe place before he decided the game was over. I reached the security room and quickly locked the door behind me. My nerves were on edge, but for a brief moment I felt a bit safer. I looked around, searching for something that I could use to better defend myself. There was a phone on the wall, and I quickly called the clinic's security, explaining the situation. They said they were on their way, but that it would take a few minutes for them to arrive. I just needed to stay safe until then. As I waited for security, I heard a loud noise at the door, as if something was being dragged on the other side. The patient was trying to get in. I gripped my improvised weapon tighter, knowing that if he managed to get in, it would be the final confrontation. Adrenaline was rushing through my veins, and I was ready to defend myself at all costs. The sound of metal against metal echoed through the room, growing louder and more desperate. He was forcing his way in, and I knew I didn't have much time. The door began to give way, and I braced myself for impact. When he finally managed to create an opening, I saw his silhouette in the flickering light of the corridor. His eyes were fixed on me, full of a disturbing intensity. "I'm just playing, Sophia," he whispered. But the malice in his voice made it clear that his intentions were much darker. He advanced towards me, and I knew I couldn't avoid the confrontation any longer. He lunged at me with surprising strength, and I barely had time to react. I used my improvised weapon to block his attack, but he was strong and determined. We struggled for what felt like an eternity, each trying to overpower the other. The security room, which had once seemed like a refuge, was now an arena of combat. I knew that if I couldn't neutralize him, I wouldn't get out of there alive. With a quick move, I managed to hit him hard enough to make him back off. I took advantage of the moment to push him away and run towards the door. With adrenaline still high, I used all my strength to try to lock the door with him inside the room, but I knew the door was already damaged and wouldn't hold for long. So I ran to another room nearby and locked myself in while I waited for help. Inside this other room, I could hear him banging angrily on the door, which quickly gave way again. Almost instantly, the patient began pounding on the door of the room where I was, trying to scare me with disturbing screams and laughter. Each bang echoed in my ears, amplifying the terror I felt. I looked around, searching for something to better protect myself or use as a barricade, but I knew that even then, I could only hold out for a few more minutes. I sat on the floor with my back against the wall, trying to stay calm. The incessant banging made my mind spin, and the sense of isolation was overwhelming. I was alone, trapped with someone who had clearly lost control. I knew he wasn't just playing, as he had said. He wanted to hurt me, and he was enjoying my fear. Every passing second felt like an eternity, and I wondered if help would arrive in time. Time seemed to drag on, and I began to wonder if I would really get out of there. My mind filled with desperate thoughts, but I knew I couldn't afford to give up. I needed to keep fighting. I needed to survive. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to block out the sounds and focus on my breathing. This helped me clear my mind and prepare for any eventuality. Then, I heard something that made my heart stop. The sound of people running. It was the security team approaching. Finally, help was on the way. I knew I just had to hold out a little longer. The renewed hope gave me strength, and I stood up, gripping my improvised weapon firmly. I was ready to face him again if necessary, but I knew I was no longer alone. The pounding on the door continued, but now it sounded less threatening, as if he knew his time was running out. Finally, the security team entered the wing where we were. The patient was quickly subdued and sedated, but before being taken away, he looked at me with a disturbing smile and said, "I was just playing, Sophia. I just wanted to have a little fun." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I knew the situation was under control. Adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, but the relief of knowing it was all over began to set in. With the patient sedated and securely locked away, I was finally able to relax a little. The tension of the night had drained my energy, and I felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally. The security guards helped me sit down, offering words of comfort and praise for how I had handled the situation. However, the patient's words still echoed in my mind. I was just playing. The coldness with which he had said that disturbed me deeply. The silence of the warehouse was always something I appreciated. Working the night shift gave me a sense of peace, away from the hustle and bustle of the day, where I could focus on my tasks without interruptions. My job was simple: check the inventory and make sure everything was in order by dawn. That night, like so many others, I entered the empty warehouse, adjusted my uniform, and began my usual rounds. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the walls, and the only noise was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. However, I soon noticed that something was different. During my initial check, I realized that some items in the inventory were missing. They weren't large things, just small objects that wouldn't catch your attention at first glance. I checked the records and the shelves repeatedly, trying to find an explanation. But there were no signs of a break-in, no clues that anyone had entered unnoticed. The feeling that something was wrong began to settle in. I tried to ignore the growing discomfort, attributing the missing items to a counting error, or perhaps an employee from the previous shift who didn't properly record the withdrawals. But the thought kept bothering me. I started retracing my steps through the warehouse, looking more closely at every corner, every aisle, hoping to find some clue that would explain what was happening. But with each step, the feeling that I was being watched grew stronger. As I walked through the long, silent aisles, a sense of unease began to take over me. It was as if the atmosphere of the warehouse had suddenly changed, becoming more oppressive. I forced myself to continue, trying to focus on my tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. What had always been a peaceful refuge now seemed to be hiding something dark. I decided that I needed to be more careful that night. Whatever was happening, I was determined to find out. But the more I thought about the missing items and the feeling of being watched, the more the unease grew inside me. Something was definitely wrong, and I knew this night would be different from all the others. As the night wore on, I began to hear sounds I couldn't ignore. Initially, they were just light noises, as if something was being moved in the distance. I thought it might be the building settling or perhaps a small animal that had gotten in, but soon the sounds became clearer and more disturbing. The sound of boxes being dragged across the floor echoed from somewhere deep in the warehouse, followed by quick footsteps that seemed to flee from my direction. With my heart racing, I headed toward the sound, trying to discover its source. But every time I reached the spot where I thought the sound was coming from, there was nothing there. The aisles were empty, the boxes in place, and there was no sign of anyone. The unease in my chest was turning into a growing fear. I began to question my sanity. Was I hearing things that weren't there? Or was there really someone moving stealthily through the warehouse, playing with me? I continued my checks, trying to convince myself that the sounds were just a product of my imagination. But each time the sound repeated, it seemed more real, closer. I felt sweat trickling down my forehead as I walked through the aisles, trying to stay calm. The silence between the sounds was even more unsettling, as if the warehouse itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I decided I could no longer ignore what was happening. It was clear that something or someone was moving in the warehouse, and I needed to find out what it was. The thought that it could be an intruder or someone hiding there made my skin crawl. But there was no turning back now. I had to know what was causing those sounds and why the items were disappearing. With my nerves on edge, I began to walk more slowly, paying attention to every detail, every sound. The warehouse, which had once been a familiar and almost welcoming place, now seemed full of invisible threats. Every step I took was calculated, and I mentally prepared myself for whatever I might encounter. But even with all my caution, the warehouse seemed to have a life of its own, conspiring against me at every dark corner. The growing unease led me to make a decision. I needed to review the security cameras. If there really was someone or something moving through the warehouse, the recordings might show me what was going on. With quick but cautious steps, I headed to the security room, where the monitors displayed different angles of the warehouse. I sat down in front of the screens and began reviewing the night's footage, feeling a mix of anxiety and anticipation. As I watched the images, my breath caught in my throat. In one of the aisles, I saw a figure moving. It was someone wearing the company uniform, but the face was out of focus, as if intentionally hidden. The figure moved carefully, almost stealthily, stopping to check the shelves before disappearing into one of the side aisles. I was shocked and frightened. Who could it be? And what were they doing there? I rewound the footage and watched it again, trying to see more details. But every time the figure appeared, the face was obscured, either by the poor quality of the camera or by the person's position. This made me even more uneasy. The idea that someone was hiding in the warehouse, wearing the company uniform but not wanting to be identified, was disturbing. I started to think about who it could be, but none of my guesses made sense. I continued reviewing the footage, trying to find more clues. In some images, the figure seemed to be carrying something, but I couldn't identify what it was. All the while, the feeling that something was wrong only grew. The thought that I was being watched by someone inside the warehouse, someone who knew exactly where the cameras were and how to avoid them, sent chills down my spine. I knew I needed to act, but the fear of the unknown was paralyzing me. Finally, I decided I needed to confront this figure. If someone was hiding in the warehouse, it was my duty as an employee to find out what was happening. But the thought of going out in search of a person who clearly didn't want to be found was terrifying. However, there was no other option. The night was just beginning, and I knew I needed to keep a cool head if I wanted to get to the bottom of this mystery. Determined to solve the mystery, I decided to explore parts of the warehouse that I normally didn't check during my rounds. If someone was hiding there, there must be a place where they could stay unnoticed. With a flashlight in hand, I started exploring the less frequented areas, those that were far from the cameras and rarely used. The further I went, the more my apprehension grew. The silence was almost oppressive, and every sound seemed amplified. It was during this exploration that I found something that made my skin crawl. Behind a pile of boxes, I discovered a small opening in the wall, almost imperceptible. Curious and with my heart racing, I pushed some boxes aside and realized that the opening led to a hidden space. The place was dark and had a peculiar smell, like dirt, as if an animal had been living there. I entered slowly, lighting the way with my flashlight, and what I found inside made my blood run cold. It was a hidden area, a sort of makeshift hideout. There were mattresses thrown on the floor, dirty blankets and food wrappers scattered everywhere. Someone was living there, hiding inside the warehouse. The discovery confirmed my suspicions, but it also left me even more frightened. Whoever it was, they were hiding on purpose, and the fact that no one had noticed before made me nervous. I looked around, trying to better understand what was going on. Besides the evidence that someone was living there, I found some tools, probably used to open boxes or move items without being detected. Everything was starting to make sense. The missing items, the strange sounds, the figure on the cameras. Everything pointed to someone who had made that place their hideout. But who and why? As I left that hidden space, I felt the pressure of the situation intensify. If that person discovered that I knew about the hideout, what could happen? The feeling of being watched grew even stronger, as if the person was there, hidden in the shadows, waiting to make their next move. I knew I needed to act quickly, but with every step I took, the fear that something would go terribly wrong paralyzed me. With the discovery of the hideout still fresh in my mind, I began piecing together the puzzle. One name in particular came to mind, a former employee who had recently been fired under suspicious circumstances. I remembered hearing some rumors about him, that he hadn't taken the dismissal well and had disappeared since then. The idea that he might be hiding in the warehouse, living in the shadows, started to seem more and more plausible. I spent the rest of the night with my mind racing, trying to understand how someone could live there without being noticed. But at the same time, the feeling of being watched only increased. The warehouse, which had once been a familiar and safe place, now seemed full of hidden dangers. Every noise, every shadow seemed to carry an invisible threat. Fear began to mix with adrenaline, and the idea of confronting this former employee made me more and more nervous. I knew I couldn't just ignore what I had discovered. I needed to do something, but the idea of confronting someone who had already shown aggressive behavior was terrifying. What if he was armed? What if he decided I was a threat? These questions echoed in my mind as I tried to plan my next move. The tension in the warehouse was palpable, and I felt that at any moment something could happen. As I continued my rounds, trying to appear calm, I couldn't stop thinking about how the former employee might be watching me, waiting to see what I would do next. The feeling of being followed, of always being one step behind someone who knew the warehouse as well as I did, was terrifying. I knew I needed to be careful, but the growing tension made it difficult to think clearly. I decided that the best thing to do would be to return to the hidden area and check if there was anything else that could help me understand the situation. Maybe there was something I had missed, something that could give me an advantage. But the idea of going back there, alone, knowing that the former employee might be nearby, made my stomach knot. Even so, I knew I had no choice. I needed to find out the truth before it was too late. With my heart heavy with uncertainty, I decided to return to the hideout I had found. The thought that the former employee might be nearby, perhaps watching my movements, made me even more cautious. Every step I took towards that hidden space was calculated, and the darkness of the warehouse seemed more threatening than ever. I tried to control my breathing, staying alert to any sound or movement around me. When I finally reached the hideout, my heart raced as I realized that something had changed. The space that had once been full of evidence that someone was living there was now empty. The dirty blankets, the food wrappers, even the tools, everything had been removed. It was as if the person had moved out in a hurry, taking everything they could carry. The only sign that someone had been there were the marks on the floor and walls, but there was nothing else. The fear I felt turned into dread. I knew the former employee had discovered that I was investigating, and now he seemed to be one step ahead of me. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I began to wonder if he was leading me into a trap. Everything I had discovered so far pointed to an imminent confrontation, and I didn't know if I was prepared for what might happen. As I searched the hideout for any clue I might have missed, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Soft but determined footsteps echoed through the corridor outside the hideout. Someone was approaching, and I knew it wasn't another employee. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely hear my own thoughts. I needed to quickly decide what to do. Run or confront whoever was coming. I decided that the best option was to hide and observe. I pressed myself against the wall of the hideout, trying to control my breathing as the footsteps got closer. Adrenaline was coursing through my veins, and the tension was almost unbearable. The only thing I knew was that at that moment, my safety was at stake. Fear and uncertainty were overwhelming me, but I knew I had to be prepared for anything. The footsteps got closer, and I knew that confrontation was inevitable. I gripped tightly the object I had picked up as an improvised defense, feeling sweat trickling down my hands. Then, the silhouette appeared at the entrance to the hideout. It was him, the former employee. His face was covered with an expression of desperation and anger, and the threatening glint in his eyes put me on high alert. He was holding something in his hand, and my heart stopped when I realized it was a weapon. "I knew you were following me," he said, his voice low but full of tension. "You shouldn't have gotten involved in this." Fear paralyzed me, but I knew I had to stay calm. Any false move could be fatal. "I don't want any trouble," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just doing my job." But he didn't seem convinced. The weapon trembled in his hand, and I could see that he was on the verge of losing control. He took a step forward, keeping the weapon pointed at me. "You're going to help me cover this up," he continued, his voice trembling. "No one needs to know I'm here. I just need more time." The situation was critical, and I knew that my next action could determine the outcome of everything. I tried to think of a way to calm him down, to convince him to lower the weapon. But the desperation in his eyes told me that he was willing to do anything to protect himself. I tried to appeal to his reason. "Look, you don't have to do this. We can resolve this another way. I won't tell anyone." But he shook his head, visibly disturbed. "It's too late for that. You already know too much." Fear took hold of me, but I knew I couldn't give in to panic. I needed to find a way to get out of this situation alive. The tension was palpable, and every passing second seemed to drag on in slow motion. The weapon trembled even more in his hand, and I knew the risk of him pulling the trigger out of pure nervousness was high. Then I heard something in the distance. Quick footsteps, voices, someone approaching. Maybe it was the security team, finally coming to check on what was happening. The momentary distraction made him look away for a second, and I knew that was my chance. I took advantage of the moment and shoved him with all my strength, running for the exit before he could react. I ran through the warehouse corridors, my heart pounding and adrenaline pumping. Behind me, I heard his footsteps, but I also heard the voices getting closer. Security was finally arriving, and that gave me a glimmer of hope. I kept running, not looking back, focused only on reaching a safe place. The warehouse, which had previously felt like an oppressive labyrinth, was now my only refuge, and each step brought me closer to safety. Finally, I saw the security team's flashlight beams in the distance, and I ran towards them. When they saw me, they quickened their pace, and within seconds they were around me, protecting me. I tried to quickly explain what had happened, pointing in the direction from which I had fled. "He's armed," I managed to say, still out of breath. The security guards wasted no time and ran in the direction I had indicated, ready to confront the former employee. As they ran, I stood there, trying to catch my breath and process everything that had happened. The tension still gripped my chest, but the worst seemed to be over. I knew I had made the right decision not to confront him alone and to wait for security. Even so, the image of him, desperate and armed, continued to haunt my mind. It had been a terrible night, and I knew it would take time to forget what I had experienced. A few minutes later, the security guards returned, with the former employee restrained between them. He was unarmed and seemed to have finally given in to exhaustion and hopelessness. As he passed me, his eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something beyond the anger and desperation. There was a deep sadness, a sense of defeat that touched me. He muttered something, which I could barely hear, but it sounded like, I just wanted a place to stay. The security guards took him out of the warehouse, and I stood there, still trying to make sense of everything that had happened. I knew that in a way he was a victim of circumstances, but that didn't justify what he had done. The night was over, but the feeling of danger still hung in the air. I was exhausted but relieved to be alive. I knew that experience would stay with me forever, a memory of a night when routine work turned into a nightmare. As I left the warehouse, the first rays of morning sun began to light up the sky. I was safe, but the fear and adrenaline were still coursing through my body. I knew that things would never be the same again, and that the warehouse, a place where I used to find peace, was now marked by a terrifying memory. However, I also knew that I had survived, that I had faced the danger and come out on the other side. The warehouse was silent again, but for me, the shadows of that night would never completely disappear.